Welcome back, everybody, to Ecolunch. I'm going to get us kicked off here. I am Lishka Arata, Senior Communications Coordinator here at Point Blue, and I'm happy to see so many joining for our relaunch of Ecolunch. So for those who are joining for the first time, and for those who kind of forget what these are all about, these are casual lunchtime talks that are usually about science, presented usually by our staff, but they can stray to other topics, and we can have guest speakers. And they are meant to foster a culture of continued learning, sharing science, and collaboration. So anybody can present at an Ecolunch, and you're welcome to reach out to me. I have appointed myself as the current coordinator for at least the time being. If you want to get on the schedule, feel free to reach out to me. So this month's theme is oceans. Since it's Coastal Cleanup Month, you guys are welcome to join me at Doran Beach in Sonoma County on the 17th, or do your own. There's info about that in the little thingy I sent out. And in today's topic, we're going to learn about how our science is informing how we can help ships avoid striking and harming or killing whales, and Cotton Rockwood is our guest. Sadly, we just saw some news about this topic that Zach sent around, so this is still very important work. So we're happy that we're involved and excited to learn more about it today. And one thing that I'll be thinking about as Ecolunch coordinator is future themes. So if you have future theme ideas for Ecolunch month-long themes, go ahead and pop them in the chat or email them to me. And these Ecolunches are going to remain virtual for now. Hopefully we'll be able to do some in-person ones in the future, but I'm just going to keep them virtual for this point in time. It's kind of nice that people can join from anywhere they are on the virtual aspect, so that's good. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm going to be recording these. We're recording now, and I'll save them on the Comms Hub in a newly created tab. It's not up now, but it will be soon. So yeah, that's a little bit about Ecolunch. Thanks everybody for keeping yourself muted while we go along here. And I'm gonna give a quick intro of Cotton before handing the mic over to him. So Cotton is our senior marine ecologist, and in his position, he works on studying big marine animal ecology and species modeling. He also works on marine spatial planning. He's developed decision support tools to help reduce whale ship strikes, which he'll be talking about today. And he's also been working on improving how offshore wind energy is planned. And you can read a little bit more about that on our report section of our website. Cotton's overarching mission is to understand and then lessen the negative impacts of human activities.
Recording in progress.
Oh, yes. Please keep yourself on mute if you've just joined. Thank you. And so he does this by using our awesome long-term data sets and working with management partners. Cotton grew up in Sonoma County, just like me. We actually didn't know each other that well growing up, but we had mutual friends. And he developed his love of ecosystems he now works to protect as a science by growing up in this area. He's an alum of UC Davis and the Scripps Institute of Oceanography. And his studies have taken him to places like Costa Rica and the beautiful west coast of Canada's Vancouver Island. And when he's not working to save whales, you can find him surfing, rafting, biking, backpacking, or horseback riding. So thank you so much, Cotton, for sharing your work today. And before I pass the mic to you, I'd like to recommend that you all have a digital or physical notepad to jot down your questions as they pop up during his presentation. There are no stupid questions. And I'll be jotting down my own questions as we go along. So with that, I will hand the mic to you, Cotton.
Thank you for the introduction. Let me go ahead and get my presentation up here. And great to see everybody. Some very few of you I don't know. Great to meet you virtually, and everybody else, nice to see you virtually. which is about all I get because I am now located up here in the Pacific Northwest right now. So fairly rare to get to see everybody in person, but really nice to get this opportunity to present. So, and shout out to our former Ecolunch coordinator, Jay, for always doing that in the past. And thanks, Leisha, for getting this going again. It's definitely a great way to bring people together and learn about what's going on in the org. So with that, I guess I will go ahead and get started. So this is just going to be a presentation that's kind of at a relatively high level, give you more of a perspective on the science that we've done at a very basic level, but how it's sort of fed into the policy that's gone on along the West Coast and some of the changes that have been instituted in a large part due to our science, which is really encouraging, and some of the things that we're still working on going forward. So this is something that we're really still heavily engaged in, which is really great. So this is all focused on the West Coast, and really this problem has been around for a long time, but has been sort of accelerating in the past decades. So just a quick overview is that we've got these amazing whales. Some of you, I'm sure, have seen them out off of our coasts here. There's a number of species, but especially of concern for this problem are blue whales, humpback whales, and fin whales. And so the organization that sort of is in charge of managing those, the government organization, is the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. And they do every year, they look at the population, they try and estimate the population, and they do what's called a stock assessment report, where they go and they look at all the information available, the growth of the population historically, and they estimate what's called PBR. It's basically a number that says we can have as many as this number of whales killed in this population and still make sure that that population is recovering and maintaining a healthy numbers. And so there's, you can see these numbers here, the most recent ones for each of these species. The populations have grown over time for the most part, although it's a little uncertain in the case of blue whales and a certain subpopulation of humpbacks. That said, despite that, they are all listed as endangered or threatened, and so they're protected. And so any kind of mortality is of concern. And one of the main causes of mortality for these species is ship strikes, unfortunately. And so we get these large whales washing ashore as an indication that that is happening out there. Some of them are from other causes, like entanglement in fishing gear, but a good number are from large ships hitting these whales and unfortunately causing significant trauma and in many cases killing them. But what we do know is that the number of whales that wash ashore is just a small fraction of the number that are actually killed at sea. And so, and even among those, we don't always know the cause of death. So we're really drastically underestimating the number of deaths by strike, just in counting the stranding whales. And what we find is that that number is actually about, oh, there's a blank slide, 5% of the total likely number killed. So very small proportion. So how can we address this problem? We have to kind of get at it a different way. And that's where we came into this issue, is trying to model the number of likely deaths that occur. And we did that, which is this kind of trying to bring in as many of these factors as we can that contribute to deaths by ship strike. And basically the gist is that we have information on the distribution and the speeds of ships, their sizes, and we have information on the distribution of the whales and some of their behavioral characteristics. And so we can put those together in a probabilistic statistical model and try and get at the number of encounters between whales and ships, and therefore the number of likely deaths. And so we did that along the whole coast of the West Coast for these 3 different species. And this is the picture that we get about sort of where those strikes are likely to happen. You can see it's a little bit different for the different species given their distribution across space. And what we do is then calculate, kind of add these estimates up across space, and we can get to a sort of broad estimate of what those numbers look like. And they're fairly significant, especially when you start comparing them to those limits that the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, calculates each year. And again, those limits are for all potential human caused deaths, and this is just the ship strikes. So that's a large portion. So going forward from there, we really wanted to zoom in and look at some of these especially high risk areas. And those are also areas where there's been the most political will and the most management capacity to try and address ship strikes. So we're looking close again here where we do our own surveys as part of the access program in the oceans group. And so we have our own data where we can model the distribution of whales more in a finer scale. And then in Southern California, there's also overlap of high ship traffic with high whale densities. But in doing that, like, what are we trying to get at? What can we actually do? And the important thing is that there's been a fair amount of work, especially on the East Coast, that really has established that if ships go slower, then we really get a decrease in the risk of lethal strikes. So it not only gives the whales potentially a chance to avoid a ship, although that's fairly, that capacity is fairly limited, but also if they actually are hit, that the impact is much less likely to be lethal. So slowing vessels down is one of the main tools that we have. And then the other way is, of course, separating whales from the ship traffic as best we can, or rather the ship traffic from the whales. So knowing where the whales are using space most intensely, and then trying to avoid those areas with ships as best possible. So in looking at these more specific areas where there's these concentrated paths for ships and shipping lanes, we really wanted to take three different three paths to assessing what's going on. One is to get a regional model where we're looking more specifically at what the ship strike risk is and what the estimates for mortality are in those specific regions, kind of refining what we did at that broad scale. The second is there are these vessel speed restrictions that have been put in place by the National Marine Sanctuaries, both the Channel Islands in Southern California, and then offshore here, the Cordell Bank and Greater Farallones National Marine Sanctuaries. And so those are voluntary. They ask vessels to slow down to that 10 knots in certain areas. And so we're trying to look at what those, the effects of those programs have been, and then simulate what would happen if those programs maybe changed, if the voluntary cooperation with those programs increased, and if we cover potentially different areas with those speed restrictions, and then recommend actions, of course. So we did that in Northern California, and what we found is for blue whales, just in this relatively small area, we estimated about 2.7 deaths per year, and for humpbacks 7. And of course, it's concentrated in these heavy use areas where the ship traffic travels through the traffic separation schemes or shipping lanes. And then based on that, you can see that while a lot of that risk and those potential mortalities are concentrated within the lanes, there's also these areas at the end of lanes where ship traffic sort of disperses on their trajectories to wherever they're going that are not covered by those vessel slowdowns. So in the Northern California, they were historically, the slowdowns were requested within the shipping lanes only, the area outlined here in green. And so what we recommended was that these additional areas might be covered by the slowdown as well, so that we could really try and limit the mortality in those regions of high risk as well. And then in Southern California, we did the same kind of assessment, applying our model, calculating those estimated mortalities. And unsurprisingly, the high risk is really in these lanes. It's a little bit different. We were able to actually do this for humpback whales in 2 different seasons, the high peak season, which is the summer season, and then also in the winter when the whales in theory are not around as much. But what actually this showed was that those whales are just moving more offshore, and the risk is still relatively high. And so overall, we had an estimate of about 9 deaths in this specific region for blue whales each year, about 10 for fin whales. And then between the 2 seasons, and again, these blue whale and fin whale estimates are limited to that peak summer season, whereas with the humpback whales, we're able to calculate both seasons, and that estimate is really pretty significant at over about 10 deaths in total year round. So that was a concern, and that was the first time we were able to do that sort of year-round assessment. So based on that, we also sort of made some suggestions about where the slowdown could expand, and that again is where those ships leave the ends of the traffic lanes and spread out. And then there's also quite a good amount of shipping traffic that travels outside of the traffic lanes and to the south. You can see that here in these maps as well. Even though there's not an official shipping lane, they take that route because it's a little bit slower or a little bit faster to get out of these areas where they have higher quality fuel requirements. And so putting in place the restriction down in those areas as well would additionally help with reduction of ship strike deaths. So those were kind of our recommendations. And overall, we also, again, assessed the effect of those speed restrictions historically. In Northern California, what we found was, given the amount of cooperation that for blue whales, the speed restriction program had reduced the sort of status quo number of strikes by about 12% and humpbacks about 10%. In Southern California, there's a lot less cooperation, and it's over a much bigger area, so those percentage decreases were a lot smaller, about 3%-ish or so, 2 to 3%. So just kind of summarizing these things in terms of looking at those 2 specific areas. In Northern California, there was that 10 to 12% success of the program so far. If they were to expand that cooperation, really get that to go up to 80 or 90%, which is what has been seen in some places on the East Coast, then you could further decrease the number of deaths by 7 to 16%. And then if you added those speed restrictions at the end of the lanes where we recommend it, that would total to about a 30 to 35% reduction. So really some potential big gains according to our model calculations. And then in Southern California, again, that much lower success rate with the program so far. And if they put in some of these additional measures that we recommended, kind of getting up to about a 30% reduction in that area. So again, potentially really some big benefits with improved management. So overall, again, really trying to increase cooperation was one of our big recommendations. So there are now dedicated staff that are really working on these programs and trying to get shipping companies to cooperate, and that has gone up over time, slowly. But another component of that is potentially considering mandatory regulations, and that's something we've talked with the sanctuaries and NOAA managers a good bit about, and they are considering that as a possibility. And then establishing those additional areas is another recommendation that we made as well. And then we also made some recommendations in terms of the traffic scheme there in Southern California. There was an original effort to potentially get a lane instituted south of the Channel Islands in that area where the traffic goes without a lane. Because it's so broadly distributed, it would be better to narrow it down. There was some pushback from the Department of Defense, but really considering that again was a recommendation we had, and then as well considering eliminating some of the lanes in Northern California to decrease the overlap with some of the higher concentrations of whales to the north and south of San Francisco Bay. So some of the really great success components of this is that they are really getting increases in vessel cooperation. These are a little bit older in 2020, but they have continued to even increase from there a little bit. So going from quite low in 2017 when we first did some of our evaluations to decent in 2020 and a little bit more since then. There has also been enlargements of those speed restrictions, so that's been a real success. And in Southern California, they actually submitted a proposal to the International Maritime Organization, which has to approve changes to official shipping lanes to extend the lanes in Santa Barbara to be a little bit further offshore, which can be helpful as well. And then there's currently consideration for rerouting the San Francisco lanes to improve their overlap with whales. So this is just some maps of those expansions. So now, rather than just doing in San Francisco, just covering those lanes, the speed restriction covers the entirety of these sanctuaries. So that's a really big win, and it actually goes beyond what we were recommending. And similarly, in Southern California, they've got this very large speed reduction zone that they request the speed of vessels to be 10 knots for. So those have been really big wins, and there are some considerations for even further expanding in Northern California. So that's great. One other thing that we didn't do, but there was some other work that kind of capitalized on almost a natural experiment where there was shipping traffic that shifted offshore and then back inshore because of regulations for air pollution control, actually. And what happened was the ships wanted to go out to the area where they didn't have to use this high quality, more expensive fuel when that regulation was in place. And then it became equal between the inshore waters and outshore. So they shifted back in. So you can see that these red areas in the right-hand map, that's where there was an increase again in traffic inshore. And what that means is that there's more overlap with whales because they concentrate on the shelf break. And so other researchers did sort of a natural experiment to calculate what the ship strike risk was likely to be. And what this shows is that for all these different regions in the north, in the San Francisco, central and south areas, that change resulted in when the traffic was further offshore, it was a much reduced risk for almost all species, not fin whales as much. But the idea being that shifting that traffic offshore along the whole coast could be a real major win as well for decreasing ship strikes. And so that's something that we have also been working on going forward, which is that these areas outside of those shipping lanes and those concentrated areas in Southern California are also a big concern, where the ships are transiting between ports along the coast. And so one thing we've been working on is trying to figure out how to shift traffic offshore. And that's sort of something that's going forward right now, which is that there's this management process that's been related actually to offshore wind, which is being sort of currently developed off the West Coast. And so traffic is potentially going to overlap with the areas they're considering putting offshore wind. So now the Coast Guard is going through a process where they're looking at how to change the routing of ships to account for that. And in that process, we and other organizations have really emphasized that they should be considering ship strikes as well. And so working with them to try and get ships to be transiting further offshore. So this is the draft of what they're proposing. These black areas along shore are what they're calling fairways. And that's where the traffic would be concentrated. And as you can see, it's kind of more offshore than it has been historically, which was more traveling right out off of the shipping lanes and connecting between these two. So that's potentially another major win that we're helping to analyze and move forward with. So I just wanted to, that's kind of the quick overview of everything. We've got some good successes, some really good collaboration with a lot of agencies, and a whole lot of folks that contributed to supporting this work. It was really great to be able to make some difference here. And so that's all I have, so we can talk questions and
awesome.
Yeah.
Everyone can give their clappy hands up front. I won't ask you to unmute, but reactions, clappy hands. Thank you so much, Cotton. That was awesome. Oh, look at all those clappy hands. I see them in the participant list. Nice. So the way that we'll do Q&A, we've got about 20 minutes for some discussion and Q&A. So I would like us to use the raise hand function. So if you go to your reactions, you'll see a little bar that says raise hand. And that just kind of allows folks to ask questions, get a good mix of question askers, because not everybody's excited to just unmute themselves and start talking. There's shyness involved. So, all right, I see Nadav has a hand, so keep those hand raises coming. And then also you can use the chat if you would prefer to just submit a question via chat. So we're going to start with Nadav. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Con. That's great. I was just wondering about the fin whales, because just now you were talking about moving offshore, but you just showed a graphic that looks like it would be bad for them. So what can you say more about the fin whales?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point, Nadav. So while that is true, unfortunately, sometimes you have to make some trade-offs, and fin whales are, their populations are estimated to be some of the highest out of these species. So while it may increase their ship strike risk by moving those lanes offshore a bit, there is sort of a bit of a sweet spot where you can kind of be between the higher concentrations of the species that are on the shelf, blue whales, humpbacks, and we didn't evaluate because we don't have the data to do it, but gray whales also are really close to shore and high risk. So yeah, I think that's the ideal, is really kind of moving it off into that sweet spot where, yes, there may be some more risk for fin whales, but hopefully it's an acceptable risk to protect the more endangered, smaller populations of humpbacks and blue whales.
Yeah, great, thanks.
Cool. Thank you. Great question. Next is Christy. Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, thanks. I'm curious how much whale migration is varying year to year, or just with climate change in space or time, and how if you're having to account for that, or if you can account for that in estimating these risks.
Yeah, fantastic question. And Nadav will talk a little bit about that, I expect, at one of our future Ecolunches. So that's a great segue. But we have been evaluating that to the extent we can with some of our long-term data sets, and there definitely are some changes in migratory timing. And it's hard to say what the drivers are for sure. Definitely, it looks like there may be some broad environmental climatic drivers, and so we have not taken that into account with these estimates. These are based on long-term distribution, in the sort of the idea that we really just want to get a sense for how big this problem is and how we can address it. And the distribution, with the fine scale distribution, is something that is definitely going to be more important going forward. One thing that has happened is that with warm water events, a lot of the whales are actually spending a little more time inshore, closer to shore, rather than out along the shelf break, because largely because the resources, the krill, are not in the same places, and because the cold water where there's high productivity is sort of being compressed in close to the coast. And that is going to have all kinds of repercussions. It's especially had repercussions for entanglement because the whales overlap more with the Dungeness crab and other crab fish or pot fisheries that they get entangled in the gear, but also certainly for ship strikes. So it's a little difficult to address that, but we hope that maybe with better models going forward we can. And there are some that are coming out, so that's great. Great question, Christy.
Awesome. Thanks, Christy. Thanks, Cotton, again. And next is Zach.
Thanks, Cotton. I started to have this conversation with Jaime the other day, but it sounds like there may be some research underway to translate some of the percentage reductions into maybe actual whale numbers. And I think about, from a communications perspective, it's just a little easier to tell this really great story like, hey, existing reductions have probably saved 8 whales a year or something like that. And I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit more about what that process is like. And obviously I don't want to get ahead of where the science is at, and want to be scientifically credible, but I do think it changes the story when people can start to imagine 8 whales versus a 20% reduction.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And that's actually something, we've had conversations with our management partners about, because in assessing their programs, similarly messaging that again, as you say, it's a little bit easier to talk about number of whales saved, whereas a percentage reduction is somewhat nebulous. And so with these models, we do calculate a number of whales saved in essence, or estimated to be saved. The challenge is that these are, again, based on long-term estimates in terms of the distribution of whales. And from year to year, there can be pretty significant variation in where those whales are and how many there are in the different areas. And so the number of whales saved from year to year is going to be pretty significantly different. So you can look at it long term, like an average number of whales saved per year, but in any given year, you can't predict with any kind of confidence the specific number of whales that are saved. So we do have those same numbers that you're referring to, but there's less confidence in reporting them. On top of that, they often are not very impressive numbers. So sometimes there are reductions on the order of, a half of a whale per year or something like that, which, when it comes to messaging, the messaging side of things, then you have to consider that as well. This is, it kind of brings to light a challenge with this work and this problem in general. Whales are extremely long-lived. I mean, it's the same thing that we see oftentimes with seabirds. They're very long-lived and they have low fecundity. So even having fairly small numbers killed can have a massive impact on their populations. And so it's hard for people to kind of reconcile those two things in terms of how important a small number of a little change can be for these populations.
Thanks, that's great, that's helpful.
Thank you. Next is Nancy.
Hi, I was wondering if the lack of cooperation in Southern California for reducing speed, is that because of the amount of traffic that Long Beach has and they have to get in and out, or is there a reason that you think is causing that lack of cooperation?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. First of all, the program in Southern California started a little bit longer ago, but they started by only asking for slowdowns in specific area of the Santa Barbara Channel lanes. And they actually moved that and changed the size of it almost every year for a good number of years. And so there probably was a little less clear communication for the mariners to know what they were supposed to be doing. So that's, I think, one part of it. Another part of it is that is a much longer distance they're asking the ships to slow down over, from all the way out past Point Conception at the end of Santa Barbara Channel Lane, all the way into port. So it's a bit, it's a bigger ask. So I think that's another component of it. And then, now they actually have with the expanded area, sort of settled on a steady request for that area for a couple of years now, and they have gotten some increase in cooperation. So I think, yeah, it's a combination of a number of different things.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. And Jay is next.
Hey, Cotton.
Okay.
To follow up from Christy and Nancy's question, if you, like in a perfect world, if you had full cooperation from the shipping industry and you had, you know, better data and improved models, and you could make them dynamic based on seasonality and water temperature and whatever else are the big, you know, influential factors here. Like how good could these models be? How many more whales do you think? Like what's the pie in the sky kind of picture here?
That's a great question. So there are definitely some significant uncertainties with the model. In particular, we don't really have a good grasp on how well whales avoid ship strikes. So some of you may be familiar with the models that are used for collisions with wind turbines with birds. And there's kind of different scales at which you might think about that. There's broad scale, they might avoid the wind farms entirely. Then there's like more they might avoid each turbine, and then there might be that last second avoidance of a blade. So you have to think about the same problem with this model, and there's that uncertainty. As far as improving that, there's been some work to do that with looking at tags and looking at interactions with vessels and GPS tracking and accelerometry data. So that's starting to help with that a little bit. And then also just doing a better job of quantifying the uncertainty, which is something we continue to work on. As far as improving, if the model is able to capture sort of more variability in terms of climate and all of those things, one thing we continue to hear from the industry is they actually like consistency. So having seasonal slowdowns, they even are, in some cases, would prefer just a year-round slowdown, because then they have a better capacity to plan. And that's more important to them, is to have that consistency rather than, you know, a dynamic management approach that makes it less, that makes them less able to predict what their, you know, the ramifications are for their bottom line and their business model in terms of the timing and all that. So that's something that kind of surprises us, because we often want to make management more efficient by making it dynamic if we can support that with the science, but in fact it doesn't seem like that's necessarily the best approach here.
That's really interesting, especially from the industry side of it. So I could see why there's kind of no incentive for them to go changing their planning and their how their stuff works. But is there anybody trying to get them to do that?
Yeah, so the sanctuaries have really taken the lead on this, and they actually have, you know, staff members that are point on this. They do contact the companies and sort of give them a report on their cooperation with the programs. There's also another program that I didn't mention here just because of timing. There's an incentive program that the sanctuaries and they manage in conjunction actually with some of the air resources boards. So it's the idea being that when ships slow down, there's a multiple benefits, which is you decrease emissions, carbon emissions. You also decrease particulate emissions for health concerns. And then of course you have the benefits of less noise. Ships going slower create less noise, so less noise pollution in the ocean, and then less ship strikes. So it's a multiple benefit. And so that program, they actually publicize the companies that participate and do well, and they give them awards. And of course, there's a monetary award as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Cotton. Next is Mark.
Hey, Cotton, I was just wondering how or if whale alert data that gets into your models?
Yeah, no, the whale alert data is not in these models. Those data have been used by Nadav. So again, we're gonna have another talk about that stuff. So come to his eco lunch. I'm not sure when it is. I don't have the schedule, but that has not gone into these models. It's the access data has gone to the Northern California assessment. Because those are, they're standardized approaches, and it's a little hard to combine both ship transect data along with point count type model, point count type data into the SDM for those whales. So we haven't done that.
Cool, thanks.
And we have a question in the chat from Aiden Cox, who is one of our new Antarctica crew members. Says, thank you for your presentation. Can you see that, Cotton, in the chat?
I don't have it up, but I will look.
Okay, so he says, can you speak a little bit more about how your team calculated estimates of ship strikes risk mortality over the mortality from the overlap between ship and whale distributions? Also, have there been concomitant declines in the rate of stranded ship strike victims since the implementation of the voluntary speed reduction zones?
Great question. I did not get into the details of the model because it's a little, more on the technical side. But in essence, the mathematics of the model are basically the same as you use for mark recapture. So the idea is that when you have there's a little bit of a difference because both the ship, which would be the trap essentially, and the whale, which is your target organism, are moving. So there's a little bit of difference in the math, but it's basically the same. So it's just the probability of a whale and a ship coming into close enough proximity that a strike is possible. So that's the underlying component. And then from there, we use sort of probability layered on top of that for if a whale and a ship are in the same location on a two-dimensional assessment, is the whale at the surface or is it below the level at where it could be struck? So there's a probability that we have for that based on tagging and dive profiles. And then there's sort of a calculation that's been done to estimate if there's actually a collision, how likely is there to be a mortality based on that collision. And that takes into account the speed of the ship at the time of the collision. So that's kind of the basis of the model. As far as whether we've seen declines in strandings, we haven't assessed that. It's been looked at on the East Coast where there's been some other efforts similar to this, and they have seen some declines in ship strikes where there have been high cooperation with especially mandatory measures that they put in place there. It's also a very challenging thing to assess because, as I said, at the same time as all of this is going on, these populations are actually growing, and so you'd have to account for that as well.
Awesome, thank you. And our last question is from Amanda.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, just kind of going back to the incentives for the shipping industry. I was just wondering if there's any data on the actual cost of the physical damage caused to a ship when they strike a whale, and what the fines are associated with hitting and killing an endangered species, and maybe that could be used in better communication.
That's a great question. There has been a little bit of, there's been some very back of the envelope assessment of costs in terms of damage. Most of the deaths occur because of strikes with very large vessels, and I guess unfortunately, I'm not sure, there really is not a whole lot of significant damage to the vessel from that collision. So that's damage is much more likely to occur if it's a strike with a small boat. And that is something that definitely happens and is significant. And even in some cases, though very, very rarely, either injury or loss of life to humans in the boats when they're smaller. So that's one thing. And yes, there's been a little bit of effort to try and to help with that. But again, with the shipping companies, it's not really something that is particularly concerning for them. And then as far as, I'm forgetting the second part of your question.
Oh, just the fines associated.
Fines.
I guess you would have to identify which vessel actually hit the whale.
Yeah, so that's a big challenge, is that basically holding liable any company or specific ship is incredibly difficult. So in essence, it doesn't happen.
Okay, thank you.
Great questions. Awesome questions, everybody. Thank you so much, Cotton. That was so informative. Thanks, everybody, for joining. We had 30 participants. That's a pretty good turnout for Ecolunch here. And Cotton, if you want to unshare your screen, I will share the upcoming schedule so you can see what's coming up next. It is a coastal cleanup month, so that's on the 17th. Can you guys all see that schedule now up here on the screen? All right, so yeah, next Thursday we've got Gone Fishing from the Farallones with Pete, so talking about how our data there informs fisheries. And then we've got some coastal marine work from Julie Hauer, coastal cleanup on that Saturday. If you want to come out and join us for that, contact me, and there's an event on our website, pointblue.org/events. And then the 22nd, we're talking with Nadav about whales getting tangled in fishing gear. And then we're gonna wrap up with penguins on the 29th with Dennis and Susie. So I know that a lot of you have responded to the calendar invites, so thanks for doing that. And if you're excited to join for these other ones, go ahead and mark your calendar. So thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your Thursday.